Hi, everybody. I want to go over your interview assignments. In the course, you have 3 related interview assignments to do as part of your field experience. You are going to interview 3 separate teachers. Each of the interviews must be conducted in person except potentially the English learner interview. For each of them, you need to make sure you are interviewing a teacher, not a paraeducator. The first interview you should complete, ideally, is a content area teacher. Here, you're going to interview a teacher in the content area in which you are pursuing licensure. So, if you are a vocal music student, you are going to interview a vocal music teacher. If you are a social studies student, you're going to interview a social studies teacher, and so on. This person will, I say normally here, maybe I should say often, particularly for campus based students, it will be your cooperating teacher. However, for those of you who are online, I mean, you're all online, but those of you whose program is entirely online, sometimes your mentor teacher is not in your content area. In that case, work with that person and or your administrator to find a teacher who is in your content area. You also need to interview a special education teacher. And by this, I mean someone that is their job. They aren't a classroom teacher who has students with exceptionalities in their classroom. Rather, they are a person whose assigned role, right, is a special education teacher. Finally, you will interview a teacher of English learners, and this is terminology, as I've talked about elsewhere in the course, that is in flux. Different people use different terms. It isn't stable. So this might also be referred to as multilingual learners or English language learners. Um, you might even see the very old fashioned language ESL for English as a second language or something else. Here, I want to make sure you're clear. This does not mean an English teacher. This is not a person who is teaching like, freshman English or junior English. It needs to be a person who teaches, or if absolutely necessary, who has taught in the past English language learners. In other words, students whose home language isn't English. This is the hardest person for you to find. If you cannot find an individual, you have 2 choices. One is contact people at your school, because often, even if your school doesn't have a large English learner population, there is still someone at the school or someone at the district who is responsible for sort of overseeing it in case an English learner appears. See if you couldn't find that person and interview them, but I understand that might not be possible. If you cannot locate an individual, you should contact me. I have volunteers who are willing to participate in an email and or Zoom interview. Some of them prefer email. Some of them are okay with Zoom. I would prefer you to do Zoom if you can, and if they're okay with it. But if they aren't, I know at least one person doesn't really want it to be Zoom, and that's fine. Then email is fine. That's kind of the only time I think you should use email for an interview assignment. Please start looking for these people kind of as soon as you have your placement. If you already have your placement, start looking for them right now. Please contact me as soon as possible if you can't find an English learner teacher after you've made a good faith effort to look. I will also, for that, let you choose somebody outside the school. I am in the fall, for example, somebody asked if, oh, I know somebody who is an English learner teacher, but they aren't in the school district I'm in. Could I interview them? Yes, you may. For that particular role, yes, you may. So the questions you ask each of these are going to be given in the assignment instructions, but they all have the same rubric. And so I want to go over the rubric with you and sort of how you're going to structure the assignment. Here are the questions for the content area teacher. For each of the interviews, you have a total of 8 main questions to ask. Some of them do have some sub questions. Feel free to add another question or 2 if you want, but do make sure that you address these 8 questions. So for your content teacher, I ask for you to describe their ask them to describe their teaching assignment. In other words, things like what ages, you can say what grades too, general information about the students. So in other words, do you have lots of special education students? Do you have students who are English learners? Do you have gifted students, etc.? In your classroom, do you use things like RTI or MTSS? If you don't know what those are, that's okay. Um, and at one point, I had a link there to MTSS that went away, so I need to fix that. How do you make personal connections with students? What modes of literacy do you use in your classroom? What challenges do you face for students who might have dyslexia or other issues? What types of grouping practices do you use? What about culturally responsive materials or resources do you use? What kind of text do you use? And how do you teach new vocabulary? There are no right or wrong answers here. We're not judging or evaluating. You're just trying to find out. You're getting a different perspective, and that's the point. It's a different perspective than yours. It might be a different perspective than mine. It might be a different perspective than other teachers you've worked with. I'm going to go over the questions for the other for special ed and English learners, and then I'll talk about how you're going to write this up and the rubric. So I fibbed to you a little bit in the previous section. I said there's 8 questions for each interview. There's actually 8 for the content teacher and 7 for the other 2 teachers. So here are the special ed questions. Again, describe your teaching assignment, include the ages of students, and again, like, oh, they're 8th and 9th graders, they're high school students, whatever. And overall, they're exceptionalities. You don't need, like, I'm not asking for percentages. But in other words, in Minnesota, we, for the most part, do categorical special education. So there are teachers who teach primarily kids with learning disabilities or with emotional behavioral disorders or with what Minnesota calls developmental cognitive disorders and other places call intellectual disabilities and so on. So sort of what exceptionalities do you mostly work with? In some cases, it might be all of them, particularly in smaller buildings. What kinds of reading and writing materials do you use? What are pros and cons? How do you connect with classroom teachers? Culturally responsive teaching. How do you connect with parents, families, guardians? What are challenges of your position? And do you have any recommendations for new teachers working with students with exceptionalities in their classrooms? For the English learners, the questions are almost the same. I just tweaked a few of them to talk more about English learners. So again, describe your teaching assignment, ages of students, and their nationalities. By nationalities, again, I don't need specifics, but think about too of sort of what are the languages you're working with, and if, for example, there's Spanish, as I mentioned in another video about English learners, there's lots of different Spanish dialects, right? The Spanish spoken in Central America is not the same as the Spanish spoken in Chile, is not the same as the Spanish spoken in Mexico, is of course not the same as the Spanish spoken in Spain itself, which itself has multiple dialects of Spanish in what's sometimes called peninsular Spanish. So that's what I mean. You don't. I understand. I'm not. Right, we're not asking about anything confidential. Just sort of in general. Again, do you work in classrooms or is this a pull-out program? Most of the other questions are the same as for the special ed interview, except the final one here. Do you have any recommendations for new teachers who are working with emergent bilingual students? And by this, we mean students who are just beginning to learn English or students who are also receiving special ed services. In other words, a student who is both an English learner or a multilingual learner and is also in special education. So those are the questions. Here is what your essay is going to look like. You are not transcribing anything. What you're going to do is you're going to write a 2 to 3 page paper that answers the questions, that shares the teacher's answers to the questions, but they're going to be written in your own words. You are summarizing their answers. It's okay if you use short quotes here and there, although you don't need to, but you should not transcribe the interview. In other words, don't copy what the teacher put down word for word, because throughout you need to add your own thoughts and comments. Or at least maybe not throughout, but at least at some places you need to add your own thoughts and comments, as I'll talk about on the rubric. Please make sure you double space. Make sure you use a standard font like Times New Roman 12 point. Use 1-inch margins. Indent paragraphs 1/2 inch using a tab. Don't put extra spaces between paragraphs. This is an interview, so with the possible exception of an English language teacher, you should not email these questions to a teacher and have them type their answers. The only potential exception is if you can't find an English language teacher, and if the volunteer that I have found prefers email, then of course you may email them. But in that case, be prepared to send them follow-up questions as well. Now let's talk about the rubric. I had to change rubric formatting. I can't, because of new accessibility requirements, require some what I consider not easily included in tables currently, so I'm moving away from tables, which is unfortunate for many learners, but it is what I'm going to have to do for the foreseeable future. So I've changed the rubric to be not in a table, and instead just be in text. So the first category is all question responses are addressed. So all questions are answered and addressed in the interview reflection. Information for each question response is described clearly. In other words, the information the teacher gives you has been summarized and described throughout the paper. Your opinions are included. This needs to be at least 1 to 2 paragraphs. I suggest that those paragraphs just be at the end of the essay. A paragraph, by the way, should be 5 to 8 complete sentences. I've said that before, but it's worth repeating. You should also describe what stood out the most or surprised you about the teacher's responses. And then you should use proper English conventions. So each of these categories is worth 5 points. Meets is all 5 points. Partially meets is 3 out of 5 points. And then does not meet is 0 out of 5 points. Make sure all work is your own. Obviously, do not use AI tools to help you with this assignment. Don't interview AI, interview a real person. Make sure it's your writing, not anybody else's. And so you're going to write a total of three 2 to 3 page papers. One is your paper about your content area teacher interview. One is the paper about your special education teacher interview. One is the paper about your English learner teacher interview. Because you all are in the field at different dates, like some of you don't have your field placement at the time I'm recording this, and some of you do. I am partially flexible with due dates, but I've talked about this in the syllabus of when I suggest these things be done, and that's what I put for the due dates. So all field experience work needs to be submitted by the date in your syllabus. For spring 2026, that's May 3rd. If you're watching this video in some other semester, check your syllabus or check D2L. The first interview you do should be with a content area teacher. My suggested due date for that is April 6th. However, I will not penalize it for being late as long as it's turned in by the final deadline. So the final deadline is officially May 3rd. I have still included my grace period of 24 hours, but the assignment will close on May 4th. That is true for all of the field experience assignments. They must be turned in by May 3rd is the official deadline. The grace period does still apply, but after May 4th at 11:59 p.m. Central Time, they will close and they will not be accessible. So I think the first one you should do is the content interview. If you're teaching with a teacher in your content area, I would suggest doing that interview in the first week or two that you're there. And then because the English language teacher and the special ed teacher can be a little bit more challenging, especially the English language teacher one. And just finding time. Special ed teachers are very, very busy. I know. I've been in that role. Those aren't due until the end of the semester. Please don't put everything off. So because I'm being flexible with due dates during field experience for lots of things, I'm going to have them due essentially at the end of the semester. But if you wait for everything until the last week, you're not going to do well on them. You're not going to do well probably in the field experience either. You should be working on them as the semester goes on. Submit them as you get them done, but make sure you submit them by the final deadline. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions about this assignment or other assignments, please reach out. I'm here to help. I hope your field experience goes wonderfully, and I hope you find these interviews useful, thought provoking, and informative. So long for now.